Using fresh herbs in a recipe can really add a lot of great flavor and brightness to a dish, but you have to be a little bit careful in how you prepare them. We have some herbs like basil that the leaves bruise easily, sage is the same way. You've got some that have little teeny tiny leaves that may or may not need to be chopped, and you have others like rosemary who have a very strong flavor and a very woody stalk. You need to be sure to chop those finely. Let's have a look today at basil, thyme, and rosemary. For basil leaves, and this really goes the same for sage, maybe tarragon, other very delicate leafy types of herbs. Not so much for parsley and cilantro. Those you do need to remove from the stalk, as I'm doing here, but you can just chop them away with your blade. For these leaves that might get dark or black if I'm not too careful, I'm going to lay them out on my board and just stack them up. Just make a little basil lasagna, if you will. Now I'm going to roll the leaves together, just like that. This makes for very fast work of chopping basil also. If you hold your knife, just run it down in very, very tiny increments. Cut along the length of the rolled up basil leaves. I'm using the back of my knuckles as a guide for my knife, so I never cut my fingertips off, although my fingers are holding the basil leaves nice and securely. What I have now is what you call a chiffonade in French, or a ribbon of basil. This is a very classic way to chop it, and that's all you need to do. It releases the flavor of the basil, and it gives you a beautiful presentation all at the same time. When a recipe calls for thyme, maybe a sprig of thyme, you might throw the whole thing in. I would consider that a sprig, which is about 3 or 4 stalks together, as opposed to that. It all just depends on how much you like thyme and how much you want to include in your recipe. If you just want to chop the thyme and include only the leaves, I just take the top of it in one finger and I run my fingers down the length of the stalk. You don't really want to include the thick stalk in your dish if you're not going to be removing it, so be sure to take the leaves off. I don't even necessarily chop it after that, but if you do want to chop it, or if you get some very fine thyme where the stalk is nice and soft at the tip, just run your knife quickly over, give it a quick chop, and make the pieces a bit smaller. That's all you need to do. Rosemary has a very strong flavor. It's a delicious flavor, but it can overpower a dish if you're not careful. You always want to remove the leaves from the stalk because the stalk is very woody and hard to eat. Just hold the stalk in 2 fingers, run your hand down the length of the stalk, and just take the leaves right off. I almost always chop my rosemary pretty finely to make sure that nobody gets one big mouthful of pure rosemary. It can be quite overpowering. I use my knife in a rocking motion on my board. I just use the palm of my right hand, since I'm left-handed, to hold the tip of my knife steady. And I just run it through the leaves to make sure they're nice and evenly and finely chopped. Now I'm ready to use that on my lamb dishes or whatever else sounds good for the night. After you've chopped fresh herbs, it's good to use them as soon as you can after chopping. But if you leave them in the refrigerator for a couple of days, they'll probably be okay. Just cover it tightly with some plastic wrap to keep the moisture out. Now, if you don't have fresh herbs, you can always use dried, but just use dried with a little bit of care. About 1/3 of the quantity called for the fresh herb will be enough in the dry form. Bon appetit!